81. Holy Poverty? Chalcedon Report number 342, January 1994. A few years ago, J.N. Hilgarth called attention, as have others, to the remarkable shift in the attitude towards the poor which Christianity created in the Roman Empire. The Greco-Roman world regarded the poor as barely human, as semi-vocal stock, whereas the Church proclaimed a King-Redeemer who was concerned with their salvation and advancement. The faith stressed, as Gregory the Great emphasized, that God has chosen those the world despised. J.N. Hilgarth, editor, Christianity and Paganism, 350 to 750, page 4. To call this emphasis revolutionary is to state it mildly. The poor were members of the Church now, and of society. It is easy for some scholars to write that great social differences marked the rich and the poor during the centuries preceding the Renaissance. They did indeed, but the poor were now members of the society around them, who could only be neglected at the peril of one's soul. Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. It was a common form of penance for the rich and mighty to abase themselves to serve the poor. St. Francis of Assisi simply enacted in his life and order what was already a social ideal. This doctrine of the poor had biblical roots, but also Neoplatonic influences. Both Old and New Testaments stress the care of the poor and needy. Such care was basic to the New Testament Church. At the same time, many biblical texts stress the dangers of riches. They can, like thorns, choke out the good. Matthew chapter 13, verse 22. Wealth in the hands of godly men, from Abraham to Priscilla and Aquila, can also be a great means of good. There is no virtue as such in poverty or wealth. Virtue is a moral attribute of men. Under the influence of Neoplatonism, a doctrine of holy poverty developed. The implicit dualism in Platonic thought came to mean that the material world is not good, whereas the spiritual realm is holy. In terms of Scripture, holiness does not imply the spiritual, nor does evil imply the physical. The totality of our being is fallen and needs redemption. Satan is a purely spiritual being and totally evil. All things are God's creation, and sin and evil are moral, not physical facts. Holy poverty, however, became a popular belief in the medieval era. Although many churchmen held the idea, it never had official sanction. Men like Aquinas held that there could be no intrinsic good in poverty, nor in wealth. Only if the removal of wealth were required to bring men to their moral senses could we speak of poverty as instrumentally good. The popular belief in, quote, holy poverty, end quote, was shattered by the Reformation, which, while stressing charity, required also thrift and industry, and created thereby a culture dedicated to a holy dominion. With the rise of socialism, especially Marxism, there was a return to the concept of, quote, holy poverty, end quote, but in a secular form. The socialists held, first, that the poor are the good people of the world as against the rich, quote, exploiters, end quote, the evil ones of history. This meant sanctifying the one class and demonizing others. Sin and evil now became properties of the non-poor. Secondly, logically, the poor were viewed as victims, not as failures, sinners, or anything else that would be derogatory to their status. As a result, whether they be failing students, failing or non-working workers, all such men are now commonly viewed as victims. The quote-unquote system did it to them. Third, this means a denial of personal responsibility. Racial bigotry, capitalism, the middle class, the churches, and a variety of other things are blamed for the poverty of, quote, the people, end quote. Fourth, we have thus an identification of the poor with the people, and an identification of Christians, capitalists, and the successful generally with the demonic forces in society. Never before have we seen in the Western tradition so radical a demonization of a major strata of society and a sanctification of another. In effect, what this means is, in secular terms, the less you have, the more you are as a person. Being poor, even criminal, makes you an oppressed, downtrodden person. Unless you are an intellectual, an entertainment or sports figure, or a civil office holder, wealth makes you a member of the depraved and evil class. To be productive becomes a sin. A truly biblical perspective does not despise wealth and possessions. They are an aspect of our personhood. I recently was reminded of the experiences of a man who was imprisoned in a Marxist hell. He was stripped of his possessions and made quickly into an unshaven, dirty and foul-smelling thing. He was taken into an interrogation room, stripped of all clothing. The room was chilly, with a cement floor. The interrogation officer was smoking a cigarette between sips of a hot cup of coffee. He treated the prisoner's Christian faith and calling with contemptuous amusement. As the prisoner later said, he felt less a person. He had been stripped of all dignity. Only his faith enabled him to survive. The depersonalization of man can also be accomplished by other forms of stripping, by taxation, confiscation, socialistic controls, and by a general depreciation of his freedom. It is also done by making him feel guilty for what he has when millions are poor and hungry. Such propaganda is no incentive to personal concern and charity, but to guilt feelings which make people more controllable. The political doctrine of holy poverty is a very evil one. Its dangerous consequences can only be nullified by a strong Christian faith and by the revitalization of godly charity. It is time to concern ourselves with the answers as Scripture provides them.